The notary's voice cracked through the harvest fair like a whip, and Bula Fireblood's hand was already closing around the parchment before he finished reading the third clause. And in accordance with the border treaty of the Thornwick Accord, the widow's holdings, timber rights, and the mill upon the river shall pass to the control of— Enough! The word came out low, a rumble that silenced the crowd gathered around the notary's table faster than any shout could have. Bula stood a full head taller than most of the men pressed close to watch, her green-gray skin catching the amber light of the fair's bonfires, her dark hair bound back in a thick braid threaded with copper wire that had belonged to her mother. She wore fitted leather, dyed the deep russet of dried blood, laced tight up the front of a bodice that hugged her powerful frame and left her muscled arms bare to the cold autumn air, a wide belt at her waist holding the curved falchion that had been her late husband's. She was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, something men wanted to watch from a safe distance and never up close. Notary Renwick Slate blinked up at her from behind his little folding table, his quill still wet with ink. "Madam Fireblood, the terms are quite standard for a widow of your circumstance. Once you and Master Voss are joined, the mill and the eastern timberland revert to proper stewardship under the Crown's appointed proper stewardship." Bula's lip curled back from one long tusk. "You mean handed to whichever man signs his name loudest in your ledger." Garrick Voss, the groom the notary had chosen for her without so much as asking her name twice, laughed from where he lounged against a hay cart, arms crossed, a fresh tankard sweating in his hand. He was a barrel of a man, broad through the shoulders, with small eyes that had never once looked at Bula as anything but a key that would unlock a very profitable door. "Come now, Orkwoman, sign the paper. You'll want for nothing. I'm not an unkind man." "You are exactly as kind as this contract requires you to be," Bula said, "and no kinder." The crowd around the notary's table had swelled through the afternoon, drawn the way crowds are always drawn to the promise of spectacle farmers with their carts still half unloaded. A cluster of Bula's own clanfolk standing grim and silent at the table's edge, town wives with baskets of late apples forgotten on their hips, children weaving between legs to get a better look. The great harvest fair of Thornwick Crossing sprawled behind them in every direction, tents and stalls and pens of livestock crowding the market green under a sky gone the color of a ripe pumpkin, and at the center of it all this: a table, a contract, and a woman who had buried her husband a year ago and was now expected to bury herself alongside him in a marriage she had never asked for. It was the old treaty that trapped her. Goreth Fireblood, her husband, had been granted the mill and the eastern timberland as part of the peace that ended the border wars, a generation past Orc land, worked by Orc hands, but bound by human law all the same, law that said a widow must remarry within the year or forfeit the grant back to the Crown's magistrate. Goreth had died 11 months and 3 weeks ago, crushed beneath a falling elm while clearing timber for the very mill that fed half the valley through winter. Bula had counted every one of those days. She had known, the way a woman knows a blade is coming even before she sees the arm draw back, that someone would try to use the deadline against her. She simply had not expected them to hand her a husband like Garrick Voss the way a man hands over a sack of grain. "You have until sundown to sign," Slate said, not quite meeting her eyes now. "The Crown's patience is not infinite, madam. Neither is mine." She had noticed him 3 days into the fair, though she would not have admitted it to a soul. A broad-shouldered human man with sawdust in his hair and calluses worn smooth as river stone, moving through the market stalls with an armload of fresh-cut beams, stopping every so often to check the joints of a stall roof with his thumbnail, as though the wood itself might tell him a secret. He had built half the fairground standing structures with his own 2 hands, the grain scales, the judging platform, the very mill wheel that turned in the river not 2 miles from where she now stood. She had watched him kneel in the mud to fix a child's toy cart without being asked, watched him give up his own dinner to an old widow who claimed she had none, watched him take the jeers of drunk men outside the tavern with a set jaw and no answering blow, the way a man does when he has decided long ago that dignity costs nothing to keep and everything to lose. His name, she had learned from the baker's wife, was Tobias Boone. He was standing near the back of the crowd now, a coil of rope over one shoulder, and when Voss had laughed at her, Tobias Boone had been the only man among 24 who had not laughed with him. "That's enough, Voss," he'd said, quiet but carrying. "She buried her husband less than a year gone. Have some decency." Voss had sneered at him. "Mind your planks, carpenter. This isn't your business." Bula had looked at Tobias Boone then, really looked, the way she had not allowed herself to look at any man since Goreth's pyre had burned down to ash. He had not looked away from her. That was the thing she would remember later, turning it over like a coin in her palm. Every other man in that crowd had either leered or flinched, but Tobias Boone had simply held her gaze, steady as a level laid against a wall, and given the smallest nod as if to say, "I see you. I see what they're doing to you. I am sorry for it." Now, with the notary's quill scratching impatiently and Voss's tankard sloshing and the whole fair holding its breath around her, Bula Fireblood made her decision the way she made every decision that mattered, fast, final, and without asking anyone's permission. She snatched the contract from beneath the notary's hand. "Madam, that is a legal instrument of the crown. You cannot simply—" She was already moving, 3 long strides that put her at the nearest bonfire, one of a dozen great heaped blazes the fair folk kept burning through the cold nights for warmth and light and the roasting of chestnuts. The heat of it washed red across her face as she held the parchment up before the crowd. "You want my mark on this," she said, loud enough now for the whole square to hear, "so that a stranger who has never once asked my name can sign away my husband's grave right to men who will strip the timberland bare and leave my clan nothing. You call this stewardship. I call it theft with a ribbon tied around it." Bula, one of her own clan elders, started, warning in his voice, for even now, even furious, a widow defying crown law in open market was no small thing. She did not let him finish. She thrust the contract into the flames. The fire took it fast, the wax seal blistering and popping, the careful notary's hand curling black at the edges before the whole sheet went up in a bright, sudden gout of orange that lit her face like a woman lit from within. Gasps went up around the square. Slate half rose from his stool with a strangled sound, as if he might dive into the bonfire after his own contract. Voss's tankard slipped from his hand and shattered on the cobbles, ale spreading dark between the stones. "You cannot. There is no widow's grant without a signed contract. You will forfeit everything. The mill, the timberland, all of it reverts to the crown by default if you refuse to remarry by sundown. You understand this?" "I understand it perfectly," Bula said. "The treaty says I must remarry. It does not say to whom." She turned from the fire, and the crowd, sensing something enormous rushing toward them, went utterly silent, even the livestock in their pens seeming to hush. Bula Fireblood walked through that silence like a woman walking into her own future, and she did not stop until she stood in front of Tobias Boone. He had gone very still, the coil of rope forgotten on his shoulder, his blue eyes wide. "You," she said. "Me," he repeated, not quite a question, not quite an answer. "You spoke for me when no other man in this square had the spine to. You build things that last, Tobias Boone. I have watched you 3 days now, and I have not once seen you build a thing carelessly, nor speak a word you did not mean." She reached out and took the rope from his shoulder herself, setting it down onto the cobbles between them, a small strange gentleness in the way she did it, as if clearing space. "I am Bula Fireblood, widow of Goreth Fireblood, war chief of the Asheville clan. Under the old right of my people, a widow may claim her own husband before witnesses, and no notary's ink is needed to bind it, only her word and his answer. I am claiming you, here, now, before all these people, if you will have me." The square erupted into noise shouts, one sharp bark of disbelieving laughter from Voss, the notary sputtering something about irregularity and precedent, an old woman near the front crying out in delighted scandal, Bula's own clan elder saying her name again, low and urgent, as though he might still talk her back from the edge of whatever cliff she had just leapt from. Tobias Boone heard none of it. He heard only the orc woman standing in front of him with firelight dancing along the copper wire in her braid, offering him her whole life in 11 plain words, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had spent 8 years since his wife Miriam died building things for other people's lives, and had never once thought anyone might want to build a life with him. "I don't have a ring," he said, which was a foolish thing to say, and he knew it even as it left his mouth. "I don't want a ring," Bula said. "I want an answer." "Then yes," Tobias Boone said. "Yes, I'll have you if you'll have a plain carpenter who's never owned more than one good coat." Something in her face changed then, not softened exactly. Orc faces did not soften the way human faces did, but something behind her dark eyes eased, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. "I have never wanted a rich man," she said. "I have only ever wanted an honest one." The notary, red-faced and near apoplectic, was already pushing through the crowd toward them, papers fluttering in his hand. This is not how the law works. You cannot simply declare marriage in a public square without a witnessed instrument, without seals, without. The treaty your crown signed with my people 40 years ago says otherwise, little man." The voice came from behind him, and the crowd parted for the speaker, an old orc woman with tusks yellowed by age and a staff of ironwood in her hand, one of the clan elders who had stood silent at the table's edge through the whole proceeding. "I am Kithra Ironjaw, elder of the Asheville clan, and I stood witness at Bula Fireblood's own claiming 20 years past, and I stand witness now. The right of the Ember Vow requires only a widow's public word, a chosen man's public answer, and the eyes of her clan upon it. All 3 conditions are met. Bula Fireblood has claimed this man before the fire, and he has answered. It is done, notary, whether your ledger likes the shape of it or not." Slate looked as though he might be sick. "The magistrate will hear of this irregularity. The border lord himself will let him hear of it," Bula said. "And while he does, notary, I will be writing my own terms, since yours burned so easily." She turned to the table, to the little folding writing desk with its ink pot and spare sheets of parchment still sitting untouched, and before Slate could gather himself to object again, she had swept the desk toward her, seated herself upon the bench meant for him, and dipped the quill. Tobias watched her write. Her hand was not the practiced, flowing script of a scribe. It was heavy, deliberate, each letter carved into the page as if she distrusted the ink to hold its shape without her forcing it. The crowd, still buzzing, pressed closer to see, and Tobias found himself standing just behind her shoulder, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her from the bonfire's heat still clinging to her skin. "I, Bula Fireblood, widow of Bula Fireblood, do take Tobias Boone as my husband by right of the Ember Vow," she read aloud as she wrote, "and do declare that the mill upon the river and the eastern timberland granted to my late husband under the Thornwick Accord shall remain under the joint stewardship of myself and my chosen husband, to be worked honestly and shared fairly with clan and town both, and shall not pass to any crown magistrate, notary, or trading concern so long as I or my husband yet live to tend it." She signed her name at the bottom with a firm, final stroke, then held the quill out to Tobias without looking up. "Your mark, husband." He took the quill. His hand, he noticed distantly, was not quite steady, though he had held a hammer over a nail for 8 straight hours without a tremor more times than he could count. He signed his name beneath hers, Tobias Boone. Kithra Ironjaw stepped forward and pressed her thumb, inked from a small pot at her belt, beneath both their names. "Witnessed," she said, "by the Asheville clan before fire and crowd on this day of the harvest fair." She looked up at the assembled square, at Slate still spluttering, at Voss standing white-lipped and furious by his broken tankard, at the 100 staring townsfolk who had come for roasted chestnuts and games of ring toss, and had instead watched an orc widow marry a carpenter in the space of a quarter hour. Let any man who disputes this bring his dispute to the border lord, when he arrives to judge the fair's accounts, as is custom. Until then, I would advise every soul in this square to remember that Bula Fireblood's word, once given, has never once been broken, and I would not care to be the man who called her a liar to her face. The crowd did not applaud, not exactly too stunned for that, but a murmur ran through it that was not entirely unkind, and here and there a few of the older townsfolk who remembered the peace treaties signing nodded slowly, as if some old debt between their people and hers had just, strangely, been paid. Bula Fireblood rose from the notary's bench, folded her handwritten contract with the same deliberate care she had given to writing it, and tucked it into her belt beside her husband's falchion. Then she looked at Tobias Boone, really looked at him, the way she had looked at him across the square an hour before, except now there was something else beneath the assessment, something that made his chest go tight. "Well, husband," she said, "it seems we have a mill to tend and a fair to survive. Shall we begin?" Tobias Boone, carpenter of Thornwick Crossing, a man who had spent 8 lonely years believing no one would ever again choose him first, found himself smiling despite the chaos still churning around them. "Lead the way, wife." The walk from the market square to Bula's holding took the better part of an hour, following the rutted trade road out past the last stalls of the fair, past the pens of geese and the cider presses, out to where the river cut a silver ribbon through fields gone gold with stubble. Tobias carried his own toolbox, and, after a moment's hesitation that Bula noticed and said nothing about, the coil of rope she had set down between them in the square, he had picked it back up without thinking, the habit of a man who never left good rope lying in the mud. They did not speak much on that walk. What was there to say, after all, between two strangers who had just bound their lives together before a bonfire and 100 witnesses? Bula walked with her chin high, as she always did, but Tobias noticed the way her hand kept drifting to the folded parchment at her belt, as though checking it had not vanished, as though she still could not quite believe what she had done. "You didn't have to choose me," he said finally, when the fairground noise had faded behind them and only the river's murmur and the crunch of their boots on the road remained. There were other men there, younger, men with land of their own. "I did not want land," Bula said. "I have land. I wanted a man who would not try to take mine." "How did you know I wouldn't?" She glanced sideways at him, and there was something almost amused in the set of her mouth, though her eyes remained serious. "I watched you build a stall roof for a fair vendor who could not pay you more than a loaf of bread, and you built it as carefully as you built the platform the border lord's own magistrate will stand on next week. A man who does not cut corners when no one important is watching is a man who will not cut corners with a wife either." She was quiet a moment. "Also, you were the only man in that square who looked at me and did not see either a monster or a prize. You saw a widow being cheated. That is a rare thing, Tobias Boone." He did not have an answer for that, so he said nothing, and they walked on together toward the mill in the gathering blue of early evening, two strangers now bound by fire and ink and a widow's fury, with no notion yet of what love between them might come to cost, or how soon they would be tested to find out. The mill stood at a bend in the river where the current ran fastest, a squat stone building with a great wooden wheel that Tobias himself had repaired twice in the past 2 years, though he had never known, until that very afternoon, that the woman who owned it had watched him do the work. Beside the mill stood a low longhouse of timber and hide, orc-built, warm light glowing through its single window, and beyond that, storehouses heavy with the season's threshed grain, enough to see half the valley through winter if the harvest fair's trading went well. Bula's clan, a small band, no more than 30 souls who had settled here under the treaty's grant. Farmers and millers, now more than warriors, gathered outside the longhouse as they approached, drawn by whatever news had already outrun them on faster feet. Tobias felt the weight of a dozen orc stares settle on him, not hostile exactly, but measuring the way a carpenter measures a beam before deciding whether it will bear weight. "This is Tobias Boone," Bula announced to them without preamble, the way she seemed to announce everything. "My husband claimed this day by the Ember vow. He will help tend the mill and the land. I expect you to treat him as you would treat me." A broad-shouldered orc man near the front, gray at the temples, folded his arms. "Bula, you claimed a human in the square, in front of the notary." "I did, Marek. Gorath has been gone less than a year." Something flickered across Bula's face, quick as a bird's shadow. "I know exactly how long Gorath has been gone. I counted every day of it, the way I counted every day I feared losing this land to the crown's greed. This man is honest, and he builds things that last, and he stood for me when your own courage failed you at that table." Her voice did not rise, but it hardened like water going to ice. "I did not ask your blessing, Marek. I am not asking it now. I am telling you how things stand." Marek held her gaze a long moment, then looked past her to Tobias, who stood very still, sensing correctly that this was not his fight to enter. "Can you swing an axe, human?" "I can," Tobias said. "Better than most if the wood's dry and the axe is sharp." "We'll see." Marek's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Welcome to the Asheville Mill, Tobias Boone. Try not to get my chief's widow killed with your carelessness." "I'll try not to get killed myself first," Tobias said, and a few of the gathered clanfolk actually laughed at that, low and surprised, and something in the tension around the longhouse eased a fraction, though Tobias understood, watching Bula's shoulders relax by the smallest degree, that this had been a test, and that he had only barely begun to pass it. That night Bula showed him to a small room off the longhouse's main chamber, sparse but clean, a cot and a chest, and a single shuttered window looking out over the river. "You will sleep here," she said, "until you are ready for more." "And you?" "I sleep where I have always slept. This is not that kind of marriage, carpenter, not yet." She said it plainly, without cruelty, a simple statement of fact, and something in the way she said "not yet" made Tobias's pulse quicken despite the day's exhaustion. "The Ember vow binds us in name and in law. It does not bind our hearts. That is a different claiming, and it must be earned, not declared." She studied him a moment in the lamplight, her dark eyes unreadable. "I chose you because I believed you capable of earning it. Do not prove me wrong." "I won't," Tobias said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in 8 lonely years. The first days of the marriage passed in the particular strangeness of 2 lives grafted together before either root had taken proper hold. Tobias woke before dawn as he always had, and found Bula already awake most mornings besides, sharpening tools or checking the mill wheel's bearings with a practiced hand that told him she had not spent her years as Gorath's wife merely waiting in a longhouse. She had worked this land as hard as any of the men. They fell, without quite discussing it, into a rhythm, Tobias repairing what needed repairing, reinforcing the storehouse doors, rebuilding a section of the mill race that had begun to leak, while Bula oversaw the grain accounts and rode the timberland boundary with Marek and 2 others, watching for the poachers and boundary jumpers that plagued every border holding come harvest season. The fair itself continued in Thornwick, crossing a few miles off, and word of the bonfire marriage spread through it like grease fire through dry thatch. Tobias felt the change first at the grain scales, where he'd gone on the 3rd day to weigh a wagon load of the mill's flour for trade. A cluster of townsmen who had never had much use for him before Farley the tanner, Ott the wheelwright, men he'd worked beside for years without ever once being invited to share a drink, turned their backs pointedly as he approached, and one of them, loud enough to be sure he heard, said, "Didn't figure Boone had it in him to sell himself to an orc for a bit of land." Tobias's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, only set his sacks upon the scale and waited his turn, the old familiar loneliness rising in him like cold water. It was Bula, arriving a moment later on the wagon seat with Marek beside her, who heard it, and who did not let it pass. She swung down from the wagon in one fluid motion, and the market crowd around the scales went quiet the way crowds always went quiet around her, half fear, half fascination. "Say that again," she said to the man who'd spoken, "and say it to my face this time instead of to his back." The man Farley, broad and florid, emboldened perhaps by an audience, did not have the sense to hold his tongue. "I said your husband sold himself cheap, orc woman. A land grab dressed up as a marriage, same as every treaty your kind ever signed with the crown." Tobias stepped forward not to strike, but simply to place himself between Bula and the tanner, an old instinct, the same instinct that had made him speak up in the square days before. "That's enough, Farley. Whatever you think of the marriage, mind your manners in open market." "Manners?" Farley laughed ugly. "You're a fool, Boone. She'll have that mill stripped and you dead in a ditch inside the year, and everyone here knows it but you." The crowd had grown now, drawn by the raised voices, farmers and fair folk alike pressing close with the particular hunger of people who sense a fight might be coming and do not want to miss it. Tobias felt the old fear rise in him, not fear of the tanner's fists, which he did not doubt he could weather, but the deeper fear of being the man the whole town whispered about, the man who did not belong, a fear he had lived with since Miriam died and left him alone in a house too quiet, a fear he had thought himself resigned to. Then Bula's hand closed on his shoulder, not pulling him back but standing beside him, shoulder to shoulder, facing the crowd as one. "Hear me," she said, and her voice carried over the market noise the way a struck bell carries over a valley. "This man has done more honest work for this town in 3 days than most of you have done in 3 years. He built the very platform your magistrate will stand on to collect his taxes. He fixed the mill wheel that grinds the flour half of you eat in your bread this very morning, and he never once asked for more than a fair wage for it. I did not marry him for land. I have owned this land 11 months without a husband and needed no man's help to hold it. I married him because he is the only man in this valley who looked at a widow being cheated by your notary and your crown, and called it what it was, aloud, when it cost him something to say it." She looked around at the crowd, slow and deliberate, meeting eye after eye until several of them dropped away in shame. "If any of you wish to call that a land grab, you may say so to me directly, and I will be glad to discuss it with you at length. Otherwise, get back to your business and leave my husband to his." No one took her up on the offer. Farley the tanner mumbled something and turned away, and the crowd, deprived of its spectacle, dispersed with the particular disappointment of people who had hoped for blood and gotten only truth instead. Tobias stood very still amid the slow scatter of onlookers, aware of Bula's hand still resting warm on his shoulder, aware that no one, not his father long dead, not any friend he had ever kept, not even Miriam in the quiet years of their marriage had ever defended him quite so fiercely, quite so publicly, quite so without hesitation. "You didn't have to do that," he said, echoing his own words from days before. "I know," Bula said. "I wanted to." She released his shoulder, though her hand lingered a heartbeat longer than it needed to. "Come, we have flour to sell before the sun turns, and I find I have lost my patience for market gossip today." That night back at the mill, Tobias could not sleep. He lay on his cot listening to the river's endless murmur through the shutters, turning over the day's events, the strange fierce warmth of Bula's defense of him, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, wanting rather than merely accepting his own life. He rose near midnight for water and found Bula still awake in the main chamber, seated by the banked fire, turning her late husband's falchion over in her hands, not sharpening it, simply holding it, the firelight catching the old nicks in its blade. "Can't sleep either?" he asked low, not wanting to startle her. "I do not sleep well most nights," Bula said without looking up. "I have not since Goreth died." Tobias hesitated, then crossed the room and sat not too close on the bench opposite her. "Tell me about him if you want to." She was quiet a long moment, the fire popping softly between them. "He was loud," she said finally, a faint smile ghosting across her mouth. "Louder than any orc I have ever known," and he laughed easily. And he built this mill with his own hands because he said an Asheville who could not feed his own people through winter was no chief worth following. He died clearing timber for an addition to it. A widowmaker branch, we call them, a limb that looks dead and falls when you least expect it. I was 2 fields away. I heard the crack of it and knew, before anyone came to tell me, exactly what had happened. She set the falchion down across her knees. I do not tell you this so you will pity me, Tobias Boone. I tell you because you asked honestly, and I find I would rather answer honestly than not at all. I'm not sorry I asked, Tobias said. I lost my wife too, Miriam. 8 years back, to a fever that took half the town that winter. I know what it is to have a house go quiet all at once. Bula looked up at him then, something shifting in her dark eyes, some barrier lowering by a careful degree. Then you understand why I could not sign that contract, why I would rather have burned every scrap of paper in that notary's box than let strangers decide what my grief was worth. I understand, Tobias said, and I understand why you chose a stranger over a contract, too, better than I did this morning. They sat together by the banked fire a long while after that, not speaking much more, but something had shifted between them. Some early plank laid down in the long, slow work of building trust, and when Tobias finally rose to return to his cot, Bula caught his wrist, just for a moment, her grip warm and sure. "Thank you," she said, "for not looking away in the square, for not looking away tonight either." "I don't plan to start," Tobias said, and left her by the fire with his pulse loud in his ears, thinking that a marriage begun in fire and ink might, against every expectation, be growing into something worth having. 3 nights later, the storehouse burned. Tobias woke to Marek's shout and the smell of smoke thick enough to taste, and by the time he'd pulled on his boots and stumbled out into the yard, half the eastern storehouse was already wreathed in orange light, flames licking up through the thatched roof, where the season's threshed grain lay stacked in sacks worth more coin than the whole clan would see in a year of honest trading. Bula was already there, barking orders, organizing a bucket line from the mill race to the storehouse door, with the crisp authority of a woman who had commanded raiding parties before she had ever commanded a household. Tobias fell into the line without being told, passing buckets hand over hand, the heat of the fire pressing against his face like a physical weight, sparks stinging his forearms where his sleeves had rolled back. The door was barred from outside. Marek shouted over the roar, hauling a fallen beam clear of the entrance with his bare hands. "Someone set this deliberate, Bula. This wasn't a stray spark." "I know," Bula shouted back, and there was fury in it now beneath the urgency, cold and clear. "Boone, the west wall, it's not caught yet. We can save half the stores if we get that grain out now." Tobias didn't wait to be asked twice. He plunged into the storehouse through a side door that hadn't yet caught, smoke thick enough to blind, and began hauling sacks toward the exit 2 at a time, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming. A support beam groaned somewhere above him, the particular deep creak of timber about to give, and he had half a second's warning before it came down in a shower of burning thatch directly where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. He might have died there, if not for the strength that seized the back of his shirt and hauled him bodily backward out of the falling beam's path. Bula, who had come in after him without a word, who now stood over him in the yard where she'd thrown him clear, her own sleeve smoldering where an ember had caught it, beating it out against her leg with quick, practical slaps. "You fool man," she said, breathless, hauling him up by the front of his shirt to check him over with rough, urgent hands, checking his face, his arms, for burns. "You do not go into a collapsing building for grain sacks." Half the winter stores were in there, Tobias managed, coughing smoke from his lungs. "Half the winter stores are worth nothing if my husband is crushed getting them," Bula snapped, and then, quieter, some of the fury draining into something rower, "worth nothing at all." They saved perhaps 2/3 of the grain in the end, hauled clear before the roof fully collapsed, and the bucket line kept the fire from spreading to the mill itself or the longhouse beyond, though by the time the last flames guttered into smoking ruin, Dawn was already graying the eastern sky, and every soul in the yard stood coated in soot and exhaustion. It was Marek who found the proof, kicking through the wreckage once the embers had cooled enough to search. A broken oil flask, cheap tavern glass, and beside it, half-burned but still legible, a torn strip of paper bearing a wax seal Tobias recognized instantly, having seen it stamped 100 times on trade agreements and fair permits. The notary's seal, Renwick Slate's own mark. He did this, Marek said grimly, holding the scrap up to the growing light. Or had it done. He would not dirty his own hands, Bula said, turning the fragment over, her jaw tight with a fury Tobias had not yet seen from her, cold rather than loud. But he would pay another man to dirty his for him. Voss, likely, or one of his hired men. They mean to ruin us before the border lord arrives to judge the fair's accounts, to make it look as though the mill cannot be properly stewarded, so the grant reverts to Crown control after all, contract or no contract. Tobias, sitting on an overturned bucket with a wet cloth pressed to a burn on his forearm, looked up at her. Then we need proof of our own. Something that shows Slate ordered this, not just a scrap of his seal that could have blown in from anywhere. Bula looked at him a long moment, and something like respect kindled in her expression, respect layered over the fear and fury of the night. You think like a man who has read a contract or two himself, husband. I've built enough platforms for enough magistrates to learn how their kind cover their tracks, Tobias said. If Slate's behind this, there'll be a ledger somewhere. Notaries always keep ledgers. Men like him can't help themselves. They need the paper trail even when the paper trail could hang them, because without it, they can't prove to whoever's paying them that the job got done. It was Bula, later that day, sitting with the wet cloth she'd taken over tending his burn herself despite his protests that he could manage it alone, who leaned close enough that her breath stirred the hair at his temple and said, "Lo, you are cleverer than you let the town believe, Tobias Boone." Nobody ever asked, Tobias said honestly, and Bula's hand stilled against his arm, her dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his pulse stumble. "I am asking," she said. "I intend to keep asking from now on." And then, before he could find any answer at all, she leaned the last small distance and kissed him, not gentle, not tentative, but sure. The kiss of a woman who had decided something and did not intend to spend time second-guessing it, her hand coming up to cradle his jaw, careful of the soot and the burn, her mouth warm against his despite the smoke that still clung to both of them. Tobias, startled for half a heartbeat, then answered her in kind, one hand finding the curve of her waist, the leather of her bodice warm beneath his palm, and when they finally parted, both of them a little breathless, Bula's eyes had gone soft in a way he had not yet seen from her. "That was not part of the ember vow," she said, a little unsteadily, as if surprised by her own boldness. "I didn't mind," Tobias said, "in case you were wondering." "I was not wondering," Bula said, and the ghost of a smile touched her mouth before it firmed again into resolve. "But we have a traitor to catch, husband, before I allow myself the luxury of wondering anything else." They found the ledger 4 nights later, in a strongbox hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Renwick Slate's own lodgings above the fairgrounds, counting house. Marek's idea, in truth, using an old clan trick of watching a man's habits until his guilty conscience gave him away. For Slate had taken to checking that same floorboard nightly, nervous as a rabbit, ever since the storehouse fire. Getting into the counting house after dark had required equal parts Tobias's carpentry skill, which let him ease a warped shutter free of its frame without a sound, and Bula's raw strength, which let her hold the heavy strongbox steady while he worked the lock's mechanism with a thin blade borrowed from his own toolkit. Inside they found what they'd hoped for and worse, besides ledgers detailing payments from a border trading concern, with ties to raider bands operating past the treaty line, payments made in exchange for information about troop movements along the border watch, and a fresh entry, dated the very night of the fire, recording a payment to 1G Voss for services rendered. "He's not just cheating widows out of land grants," Tobias said grimly, flipping through the pages by the light of a shuttered lantern. He's been selling border intelligence to raiders. The mill and the timberland aren't just profit to him. They sit on the old pass road. Whoever controls this land controls the fastest route through the border hills. He needs it in friendly hands. Ours weren't friendly enough. Bula's face had gone hard as stone. This is treason against the crown he claims to serve, and treachery against my clan besides. The border lord must see this the moment he arrives. They had perhaps a day to act on it, for word came the next morning that Sir Aldwyn Rook, the border lord charged with overseeing the fair's accounts and adjudicating any disputes including, Tobias understood with a cold twist in his gut. The dispute, a certain notary intended to raise about an irregular marriage sworn before a bonfire, would arrive within the day to hold formal audience in the market square. Slate, it seemed, sensed the noose tightening as well, for that same evening, as Tobias worked alone repairing the mill race by lantern light, boots crunching on gravel behind him announced Garrick Voss and 2 hired men, not the notary himself, too cowardly for that, but his instrument all the same, faces set with the particular grim purpose of men sent to finish unfinished business before witnesses could gather. Should have signed that contract, Carpenter, Voss said, drawing a long knife from his belt, the 2 men flanking him doing likewise. Would have saved everyone a great deal of trouble. Tobias had no weapon on him but the adze in his hand, meant for wood, not men, and he backed toward the mill wheels turning mechanism, mind racing for any advantage the ground might offer him. The border lord arrives tomorrow. Killing me won't undo the marriage. Bula still holds the land. A widow can't hold a crown grant alone for long, Voss said, advancing. Not without a husband and not without a mill still standing. Fire took half your grain already. Seems only fitting it finishes the job starting with you. Tobias had time to think, with strange clarity, that he had built this very mill wheels housing with his own hands 2 years past, and knew every weak plank in its structure. And he threw himself sideways at the last possible moment as Voss lunged, letting the big man's own momentum carry him into the loose section of decking Tobias had never quite gotten around to properly reinforcing. Voss went through it with a startled shout, one leg plunging into the churning mill race below, and in the chaos of his hired men scrambling to haul him free, a voice cut across the yard like a blade unsheathed. "Step away from my husband." Bula came out of the darkness at a dead run, falchion already drawn, and the 2 hired men, faced with an armed orc widow bearing down on them with murder in her eyes, made the wise if belated choice to abandon their employer to the mill race and flee into the night. Bula did not chase them. She went straight to Voss, who was hauling himself, soaked and cursing, back onto solid decking, and set the point of her falchion beneath his chin before he'd fully found his feet. "You set fire to my winter stores," she said, very quietly, which was somehow more frightening than if she had shouted. "You sent men to kill my husband. Give me one reason I should not finish what the mill race started." "The border lord," Voss began, and Bula's blade pressed a fraction closer, drawing the barest thread of blood. "The border lord will hear everything tomorrow regardless of whether you are alive to hear it with him," Bula said. "Your life is worth exactly as much as your honesty is, starting now." It took very little more than that to have Voss babbling a full confession slate scheme from the beginning, the payments from the border raiders, the plan to force Bula into a controllable marriage, and then, once that failed, to discredit the Ember Vow marriage before the border lord and seize the mill through some fresh legal maneuver, with the storehouse fire meant to prove the widow could not properly steward the grant. Tobias, breathing hard, adze still in hand, listened to the whole confession with a strange mix of relief and lingering fear, and when it was done, Bula finally lowered her blade, though she did not release the collar of Voss's shirt. "You will repeat every word of that tomorrow before the border lord and the whole fair," she said, "or I will let my clan decide what to do with a man who burns grain meant to feed children through winter." Voss, thoroughly cowed, nodded rapidly, and Bula shoved him toward Marek, who had arrived at a run with 2 other clansmen, weapons drawn, evidently roused by the same commotion. "Bind him. Keep him under watch until morning." Only once Voss had been hauled away, only once the yard had gone quiet again, but for the mill wheel's steady turning and the river's endless murmur, did Bula turn to Tobias and take his face in both her hands, checking him over with the same fierce, thorough urgency she'd shown after the fire, searching for wounds. "You are unhurt," she said, not quite a question, relief bleeding into her voice despite herself. "I'm fine," Tobias said. "You got here in time." He covered one of her hands with his own, pressing it against his cheek. "How did you know to come?" "I did not know," Bula admitted. "I felt it. Some old instinct I have not trusted since Goreth died, telling me something was wrong at the mill." She shook her head slightly, as if arguing with herself. "I do not know how to explain it except that I have come to think of you as mine to protect, Tobias Boone, in the same breath as I think of this land as mine to protect. And when that instinct spoke tonight, I did not question it. I only ran." "I'm glad you did," Tobias said, and drew her down into a kiss that tasted of smoke and river damp, and something that had, somewhere in the past week of fire and fury and stolen ledgers, become unmistakably like love. Sir Aldwyn Rook arrived at Thornwick Crossings Market Square the following midday with a modest retinue of border guardsmen. A weathered man in his middle years with a soldier's bearing, and a reputation, Tobias had heard, for having little patience for corruption dressed up as procedure. The whole fair turned out to watch the audience, drawn by 3 days of wild rumor that had only grown more elaborate with each telling. An Orc widow's fiery marriage, a burned storehouse, a notary's treason, a duel at the mill race, until the truth, when it finally emerged in the square before the assembled crowd, proved stranger and more satisfying than any rumor could have managed alone. Bula stood before the border lord in her fitted leather, chin high, the handwritten contract from the bonfire held in one hand and the stolen ledger in the other, while Tobias stood at her side, not behind her, not in front of her, but beside her, exactly where he intended to remain. Voss, true to his frightened word, repeated his confession in full before Sir Aldwyn Rook's grim, listening face, and Marek's clansmen produced the burned scrap of Slate's seal recovered from the storehouse ashes. And when Slate himself was summoned from his lodgings to answer the charges, he found no clever legal maneuver left to hide behind, only guardsmen at his elbows and a crowd's mounting fury at his back. "Treason against the crown," Sir Aldwyn said at last, voice carrying flat and final across the hushed square, "and conspiracy with border raiders and the attempted murder of a crown-recognized landholder's husband. I have heard enough, notary. You will be held for trial at the border keep, and Master Voss alongside you." He turned then to Bula, and something in his weathered face eased into what might, in a less severe man, have been respect. "As for the matter of your marriage, Madam Fireblood, I have reviewed the old treaty's language myself, on my ride here, having heard rumor of what awaited me. The right of the Ember Vow is recognized under the Thornwick Accord, plainly and without ambiguity, and your handwritten terms, though unconventional, satisfy every requirement the law demands. I see no irregularity here but a widow's courage and a notary's greed, and I know which of the two this crown ought to have supported from the beginning." He inclined his head to her, a small formal bow that drew a fresh murmur from the crowd. "The mill and the timberland remain under your joint stewardship, as your own hand wrote it. I will see to it the record reflects nothing less." The crowd that had gathered to watch a scandal unfold instead watched, in the space of one long afternoon, an Orc widow vindicated before the very crown that had tried to cheat her, and Tobias felt the last of the town's cold suspicion toward him thaw by visible degrees, as word spread through the square of everything Bula had endured and outlasted the storehouse fire, the assassination attempt, the notary's treason, all of it borne with a fierceness that even her harshest doubters could not help but admire. Farley the tanner, of all people, found Tobias in the crowd's aftermath and mumbled something that might, charitably, have been an apology. And Tobias, feeling generous in the flood of relief washing through him, accepted it without comment. That night, the fair's final bonfire of the season blazed high in the market square. The harvest concluded. The traders bound over for the border keeps justice. The mill's remaining grain safely stored, and the burned storehouse already marked for rebuilding come spring. Musicians who had been too nervous to play near the notary's table a fortnight before now struck up something bright and quick, and the whole fairground seemed to exhale at once, releasing 3 weeks of tension into dancing and drink, and the particular loose-limbed joy of people who have survived a hard season together. Bula found Tobias at the edge of the firelight, apart from the dancing, watching the flames the way she had watched them the day she'd burned the notary's contract, though her face now held none of that day's fury, only a quiet that he had come to recognize as her way of holding something precious close before she spoke it aloud. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the terms I wrote by hand that day. The ones that made you my wife," Tobias said, "before I'd so much as bought you a proper ring." "Those terms bound us in law," Bula said. "I do not regret them, but I find now that law was never truly what I wanted from you." She turned to face him fully, firelight gilding the strong lines of her face, and for the first time since the day at the notary's table, Tobias saw something in her expression that was not fierceness or fury or grim resolve, but simple, unguarded want. "I want to choose you again, Tobias Boone, not because a treaty demands a widow remarry, not because a notary's greed forced my hand. I want to stand before this fire and choose you because in 3 short weeks you have shown me more honest devotion than most husbands manage in a lifetime, and I find I cannot imagine the mill, or the winters ahead, or any single morning after this one, without you beside me." Tobias felt something crack open in his chest, some old wall he had built brick by brick in 8 lonely years since Miriam died, a wall he had not even fully realized he was still tending until this moment, watching it come down at the words of an orc widow who had chosen him out of an entire crowded market square, and had never once, in 3 hard weeks, given him cause to doubt that choice. "I choose you too," he said, his voice rough. "I chose you the moment you asked in that square, and I've chosen you every single day since, watching you fight for this land, for your people, for me. I don't have a grand treaty to offer you, Bula. I've only got the same thing I've always had: 2 hands that know how to build things meant to last, and a heart I'm giving to you without any conditions at all." "That is more than enough," Bula said, and closed the distance between them, her hands framing his face with a tenderness that belied the strength he knew lay coiled beneath, and kissed him there before the bonfire, before the dancing crowd, before her clan and his town both. A kiss with none of the storehouse fire's desperate urgency, only a slow, sure warmth that felt, at last, like a beginning rather than a rescue. They walked back to the mill together beneath a sky thick with autumn stars, the fair's noise fading behind them into the river's steady murmur, and when they reached the longhouse, Bula did not lead him to the small room off the main chamber where he had slept alone every night since their claiming. "I told you once," she said, pausing at her own door, her hand warm around his, "that this was not yet that kind of marriage, that the deeper claiming had to be earned." She looked at him now with something fierce and soft together, an orc widow's whole guarded heart laid open at last. "You have earned it, Tobias Boone, every day of it. I would have you stay with me tonight and every night after if you will." "I will," Tobias said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, only certainty, the same certainty he'd felt saying yes in the market square 3 weeks before, though this time the yes belonged to no treaty and no witness but the 2 of them. What passed between them that night was not spoken of loudly to anyone after, nor did it need to be. Only that Bula Fireblood, who had buried one husband and feared in her secret heart that she might never again let herself be known so completely by another, found in Tobias Boone's steady, patient devotion, a warmth she had thought the Widowmaker branch had crushed alongside Goreth a year before. And Tobias, who had spent 8 years believing himself destined for a quiet, overlooked sort of life, found in Bula's fierce, unguarded want a belonging he had stopped daring to hope for. When dawn came pale and gold through the shuttered window, they lay together in comfortable, unhurried silence, her head resting against his chest, his hand tracing slow, idle patterns along her arm, and neither of them felt any need to fill the quiet with words, for the quiet itself, for the first time in longer than either could remember, held no loneliness in it at all. The season turned. The burned storehouse was rebuilt before the first snow, Tobias's hands shaping fresh timber alongside Marek and the rest of the Asheville clan, who had, by winter's first frost, stopped measuring him by his human blood and started measuring him instead by the honesty of his work and the fierce, open love his chief's widow bore him, which no one who had watched the events of that harvest fair could any longer doubt. The mill turned steadily through the cold months, grinding flour enough to see clan and town both fed, and when spring came and the fair's traveling notaries and traders returned once more to Thornwick Crossing, they found the mill under new management. Neither the Crown's magistrate nor any border trading concern could touch joint stewardship, exactly as a widow's own hand had written it by firelight, bound not by ink and seal, but by something far harder to burn. On the anniversary of the harvest fair, as the market square filled once more with wagons and stalls and the great bonfires of the season, Bula Fireblood stood beside her husband at the edge of the crowd, her hand resting easily in his, and watched the flames climb high against the darkening sky exactly as they had the day she had first thrown a notary's contract into their heart and claimed, instead of a stranger's terms, a life entirely her own choosing. "No regrets, wife?" Tobias asked, echoing, though neither of them mentioned it, the very first words he had ever managed to say to her that mattered. "None," Bula said, and pressed a kiss to his temple, warm and certain, a widow no longer merely surviving her grief but living fully again, chosen and choosing in equal measure. "I would burn that contract 100 times over, Tobias Boone, if it meant I found my way to you every single time." And there, before the fire that had first bound them, with the whole fair's noise and warmth wrapped around them like a blessing neither crown nor clan had needed to grant, Tobias Boone understood at last that the loneliness which had shadowed him for 8 long years had finally, fully and forever, come to its end.